January 10th, 1983, Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. A marina parking lot in the dead part of winter, the water flat and grey, nobody around. Roy DeMeo pulls in for a meeting with two men who have worked for him for years, men he trained, men who owe him everything they have. He is not worried. Roy DeMeo has spent a decade being the reason other people are worried. His crew is responsible for a number of killings that law enforcement has never been able to fix precisely, with estimates that run into the dozens and beyond, and they built a reputation so complete that even made men avoided the block his social club sat on. He gets out of the car, and within a very short time the most feared crew leader in the Gambino family is in the trunk of his own Cadillac, where he will stay, frozen, until somebody finally notices the car. The story that survives about DeMeo is the story of the method, the club in Canarsie, the process, the numbers. It gets told as horror, and it is horror, and that framing has quietly made it easier to misunderstand what actually happened to him. Because Roy DeMeo was not killed for being brutal. Brutality was the service he provided, and it made a great deal of money for people well above him. He was killed for a much more boring reason, one that explains more about how these organizations actually work than any body count ever will. He became a legal exposure. Federal investigators were closing on the stolen car operation he ran, and the man at the top of the family did the arithmetic and did not like the answer. Understand the position Paul Castellano was in. He had a soldier who knew an enormous amount, who was about to be indicted, and who had every reason to talk if the sentence was long enough. Castellano had also spent years taking a cut of what DeMeo generated. In that situation, loyalty is not a factor. What matters is what a man can say under pressure. DeMeo went from being an asset to being a witness in waiting, and in that family, a witness in waiting has a very short life expectancy. So here is what you are going to hear. How the money actually moved from a Brooklyn social club up to a mansion on Staten Island. Why nobody wanted the contract, and how long it took to find men who would take it. Why the two men who did it were the two closest to him, and what it says about that world that the most feared man in the family was killed not for what he did, but for what he might eventually say. To see how a man who made millions for the family could be erased this quickly, you have to go back to the Brooklyn of the 1960s. Roy DeMeo was born in 1942, a quiet kid from a working-class home. He didn't run with the loud street gangs. He had a head for numbers and an abnormal patience. His first job was as a delivery boy for a butcher shop, but his real education began when he started putting small amounts of cash out on the street, loaning money to neighbors who couldn't get a bank loan. DeMeo learned early that a fist collected payments faster than a polite reminder, and he learned something darker. When a debtor couldn't pay, making him disappear wasn't just a threat, it was a cost of doing business. That thinking, cold and logical, became the seed of everything that followed. By the early 1970s, DeMeo had already built a reputation among Brooklyn's small-time criminals as a man who could solve problems that scared other people. He wasn't physically imposing, but he had a stillness that made men nervous, and a willingness to do what others considered unthinkable. That reputation reached Nino Gaggi, a Gambino capo, pronounced Ni-no Gaggi. Gaggi was an old-school mafia figure, a man who didn't raise his voice because he didn't need to. He had grown up in the life, and his entire identity was built on the principle that loyalty to the family was absolute. Gaggi brought DeMeo under his protection as an associate, and by 1977 he sponsored DeMeo's induction as a made soldier. In Gaggi's world, becoming a made man meant you belonged to something larger than yourself. The family gave you protection, but you gave the family total obedience, and most critically, a truthful accounting of every dollar you earned. Gaggi's crew handled traditional rackets, garbage carting, hijacking, some labor union influence, but DeMeo brought something that looked less like a side hustle and more like a business plan. He brought the Gemini Lounge. The Gemini Lounge sat at 4021 Flatlands Avenue, an unremarkable bar in a quiet Brooklyn neighborhood. On the surface, it was a local watering hole where regulars drank cheap beer and watched a color television. Behind the bar, however, was a different operation. DeMeo's crew ran a massive stolen car ring from the building's back lot. They would steal high-end vehicles off the streets of Brooklyn, Queens, and Long Island, strip them for parts in a matter of hours, and sell the components to body shops and chop shops across the Northeast. The frames were crushed and shipped as scrap. The scheme generated millions of dollars annually, and DeMeo kept a detailed account of every dime. The machine was elegant. A stolen car worth $20,000 on the street could be turned into $40,000 worth of parts sold piecemeal, and the parts were untraceable. DeMeo's crew employed drivers, mechanics, lookouts, and a network of buyers who asked no questions. Every part, from carburetors to leather seats, moved through a supply chain that reached as far as Florida and the Middle East. Alongside the auto theft business, the crew ran a loan-sharking book that extended hundreds of thousands of dollars to gamblers, small business owners, and other criminals who couldn't go to a bank. A typical loan might be $10,000, issued with very little paperwork, and an interest rate of 5 points a week. That means the borrower paid $500 every week just in interest, and the principal never shrank until the entire balance was paid in a lump sum. If you borrowed 10 grand, you could pay $500,000 in interest over a couple of years and still owe the original 10. The collectors were not polite. They showed up at businesses during lunch hour, they embarrassed people in front of their families, and when words failed, DeMeo deployed the next level of pressure. Fear was the true product. The original cash was just the hook. And every week, DeMeo filled an envelope with cash from both schemes and handed it to Gaggy, who in turn reported to the Gambino family boss, Paul Castellano. That envelope was sacred. It was proof that the soldier was working for the family and not for himself. Now, you have to understand who Paul Castellano really was. He became boss after Carlo Gambino died in 1976, and he operated the family like a chief executive. Castellano lived in a Staten Island mansion, drove a white Lincoln, and demanded that every capo produce a weekly accounting. He famously said, on a recorded conversation that would later become evidence, that a man who takes a single dollar from the family has stolen from every member. Castellano was not a street tough who enjoyed violence. He was a businessman who understood that power came from predictable cash flow, not unpredictable headlines. This is the detail the crime documentaries usually skip. Castellano's tolerance for murder was actually quite high, but his tolerance for financial deception was zero. Several soldiers under his reign learned this the hard way. Take the case of Tommy DeSimone, a Lucchese associate whose fate intersected with the Gambino family's logic. DeSimone, known to some as Two-Gun Tommy, had killed without permission and, more importantly, was suspected of keeping profits from drug sales that should have gone to the family. He wasn't a Gambino soldier, but the principle held across families. DeSimone disappeared without a trace in 1979, and the street consensus was that he had been killed because he had been skimming and because he was a liability. His body was never found. The message to every soldier in every family was stark. A short envelope is a suicide note. Another example came years later, inside the Gambino ranks themselves. In the 1990s, soldier Johnny Boy Rizzo was executed after the family discovered he had been holding back money from a construction racket. Rizzo was not a high-profile figure. His name never appeared in a movie script. He was shot in the head and left in a car, a frozen cautionary tale just like DeMeo, but without the Gemini Lounge mythology. The pattern was the same. A soldier earned, a soldier skimmed, a soldier died. The public never heard these names because there was no legend attached to them, but the internal message was deafening. The Gambino family treated skimming as a more serious crime than murder, because murder could be justified, but theft from the family was an injury against the entire power structure. Back in 1981, Roy DeMeo was still riding high, but the machinery was generating more heat than the family could tolerate. The FBI had opened a massive investigation into the stolen car ring, and the missing persons connected to the Gemini Lounge were piling up. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was building a RICO case that could have taken down half the Gambino hierarchy. But the real crisis started in Gaggy's own living room. The capo began noticing that DeMeo's envelope, week after week, seemed thinner than it should have been. The exact figure is disputed, but cooperating witnesses later estimated that DeMeo had held back more than $100,000 over several months. That might sound like a small amount compared to the millions the crew generated, but in the Gambino accounting system, a missing 100 grand was not a rounding error. It was a theft against the boss personally. The psychology of the moment is where the cold reality of mob life becomes unmistakable. Nino Gaggi was not a hothead. He was a careful, quiet man who saw the noose tightening around his own neck. Gaggi knew that if Castellano decided that a soldier was skimming, the capo would be held responsible. The rule was absolute. You control your men, or you die with them. Gaggi had a wife, a family, a comfortable life outside prison. He was not willing to sacrifice all of that, because Roy DeMeo wanted to pad his own pocket. So when the order came down, it wasn't delivered in a screaming rage. It came as a calm, practical instruction. DeMeo had to go. Castellano never needed to say the words directly. The message was sent through the family's middlemen, and Gaggi understood immediately that if he didn't handle the problem would be handled for him, and he would be part of the cleanup. This is the part that the crime books gloss over. The man who ultimately gave the order was not a rival gangster seeking revenge. It was DeMeo's own capo, acting on the family's behalf, because money had been taken from the envelope. The same capo who had sponsored DeMeo's membership, who had shared meals with him, who had profited from his lethal efficiency. In the end, the relationship counted for nothing. The accounting counted for everything. Gaggi turned to the only people equipped to execute the order without raising suspicion: Joseph Testa and Anthony Center. These two young men were DeMeo's protégés. They had grown up inside the Gemini system. DeMeo had trained them in auto theft, in loan sharking, and in the grim work of disposal. They were like sons to him. But Testa and Center were also Gambino soldiers, and they were smart enough to do the arithmetic. If they refused the contract, they knew their names would be added to the list, so they accepted. The machine that Roy DeMeo had built to destroy others was now turning on its architect. One man wanted to keep his cut, the other two wanted to keep breathing. The setup was as simple as it was devastating. On January 10th, DeMeo was told to meet Testa and Center at the Varuna Boat Club to discuss a shipment of stolen cars. The marina was deserted in winter, the perfect place for a quiet conversation. DeMeo arrived alone, probably still believing that he was the smartest man in any room. He got into the car with his two most trusted soldiers. The conversation likely began with shop talk, maybe a joke, maybe a question about who owed money. Then Testa and Center pulled out weapons and fired. DeMeo was hit in the head multiple times. They dragged his body into the trunk of his own Cadillac, slammed the lid, and left the car in the lot. The January freeze did the rest. For 10 days, Roy DeMeo was a missing person. His wife Gladys reported him missing, and the mob put on the usual show of concern, claiming they were searching for him. On January 20th, someone finally checked the abandoned Cadillac. The trunk was opened, and there was DeMeo, frozen solid. The medical examiner later confirmed he had been dead since the day he disappeared. The murder went unsolved for years. The Gemini Lounge kept operating for a while longer, but the crew's power declined as law enforcement pressure mounted. Nino Gaggi was eventually indicted on racketeering charges in the mid-80s. He died of natural causes while in custody in 1988, never publicly acknowledging the DeMeo hit. Testa and Center rose higher in the Gambino ranks, but their luck ran out in the 1990s, when both were convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life in prison. They never admitted to killing DeMeo, but the testimony of cooperating witnesses, including Gaggi's own nephew Dominic Montiglio, laid out the entire sequence. Montiglio described the capo's panic, the order from the administration, and the cold logic of using DeMeo's own crew as the triggermen. The truth, when it finally surfaced in federal court, was far more mundane than any Mafia movie plot. A spreadsheet killed Roy DeMeo. The Gemini Lounge itself was eventually demolished and replaced with a medical clinic, a painfully ironic end for a building that had been a site of such systematic death. The DeMeo crew's legacy lives on, mainly in law enforcement training materials and in the true crime section. But the lesson for anyone who wants to understand organized crime is permanently carved into that frozen trunk. The public version gave DeMeo the aura of an unstoppable predator. The reality revealed him as a man who made the one mistake that no amount of body disposal could fix. He forgot that in a money-first organization, the cash flow is the pulse, and a short envelope is a cardiac arrest. What this story exposes is the central illusion of Mafia mythology. Audiences are told that the mob is about loyalty, honor, and respect. But the real organizing principle is money, and the real unforgivable sin is financial deception. You can be forgiven for killing the wrong man, for drawing police attention, even for embarrassing the family and the press. But you will never, under any boss, be forgiven for touching the envelope. DeMeo was not a man who was killed because he was too violent. He was killed because he became a liability that cost more than he earned, and his skimming made him a thief in an organization that cannot tolerate internal theft. The film version of this story would likely focus on the gore, the dismemberment, the psychological horror of the Gemini Lounge. It would cast DeMeo as a tragic villain brought down by his own demons, and it would miss the point entirely. The real horror is not the blood, it is the indifference. It is the fact that a man who had eliminated dozens of people could be turned into a problem to be solved, not because of any grand moral reckoning, but because someone in an accountant's office noticed a discrepancy. In the end, Roy DeMeo was not murdered because he was a monster. He was murdered because he was a bookkeeping error. The years since have not changed the underlying rule. The Gambino family still operates, in diminished form, and the skimming taboo remains absolute. Any aspiring street guy who forgets that lesson learns it the hard way. The streets may forget the names, but the machine remembers, and the machine does not forgive. That is the real story Hollywood is still too timid to tell. Not the gangster who kills, but the system that kills its own over a column of numbers. If you found this story eye-opening, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We drop a new underworld documentary every week. And let us know in the comments, was DeMeo killed because he skimmed, or was he already doomed by the heat he brought on the family? We read every comment. Stay sharp and stay informed.